Testing, one, two, three. Testing. Good morning. I see people starting to join. If you can hear me, put a Q&A in there. I think the chat was not enabled for some reason. Okay, I see people starting to join in. I'm going to wait about a minute and a half. I hate when things start late, but I want to make sure most of you are on. This will be recorded, so I will share it with you. Let's make sure we're recording. Yes. Okay, well, good morning. I want to give a little bit of a background as to why this way, why the recording, and a little bit of introduction about me in case you're not familiar with who I am. I work across many disciplines, and I travel a lot for my work, and I go into the government, the policy side, the economic side, and the clinical medicine side. And there's just a lot of things that I think are of value to hopefully a lot of people. So this is a new forum where I'm going to try to share some of these insights directly with people interested in specific topics. I'm not sure this is going to go 2 hours. I just didn't want to be hindered by trying to squish everything in an hour, because what we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of the contextual elements of data and finding data and gathering insights from data. And then I'm going to do some data sourcing with you. And afterwards, when I follow up with a copy of the recording, what I'll do is I'll generate maybe a list with some links to some of the data that we're going to be accessing, so you don't feel like you have to, be jotting things down while you are watching. So finding our data, the question, the data, the tools, the skills. And I also like to say we're curating empathy, because when you have a graphic or you gather data and you're sharing data, there is this sort of empathy. There's a way that you want people to feel a certain way, whether it's to move them to action, to make them reconsider a thought, to digest some data about a clinical study, what have you. So that's all really important. And along the way, I became pretty much, high level functioning in Tableau, but then I also learned that there were some peripheral tools that I needed to really be able to access the data in a way that I could feel confident, especially as a consultant. If you're going to put things out on the line, you want to make sure that they've been verified. So I validated a lot of my work in Tableau by learning how to use R and Python and SQL and a few other tools that I'm probably not thinking about. And I'm giving you the approach that you could do this immediately. I'm not giving you anything that needs you to be like elbow deep in all this stuff. And a little bit about why I think this is all important as well is because, a lot of people, or at least historically, we've all been led to believe that, well, the IT department sits over there, at least when I worked in pharma. And if you have a query or a question or a business need, put it in writing, submit it, and then you wait and wait and you wait and you wait. So, but now the data is in our hands. And I just like to share this because I speak with a lot of audiences of, students and people that are new to data. I started at Rutgers and I was an athlete, and you'll be able to see that in the first two things. I was a triathlete and a cyclist, and I was gravitated towards exercise physiology and exercise science. And then I went to get a doctorate in chiropractic. And then I pivoted back to University of North Carolina, where I got a master's in biology, and I studied population genetics. And, that hard left you see there is really where I ended up working in industry and academia and in agencies and medical education. And, along the way, I started writing. And a lot of times people who are data centric, and if they can speak and they're not shy or introverted, they get a lot of opportunities. So I was very fortunate to have a lot of opportunities. Recently invited to join the National Press Club, which has given me unparalleled access to a lot of the medical conferences as media, which means, you can be there without the expense. So I can pick and choose where I want to go. And I find the most interesting parts of these conferences isn't necessarily what's happening on the main stage. It's the conversations with you and me and people that are in the audience and at the mic and challenging the status quo and wanting to, know more and go a little deeper. And, working a lot in health economics and outcomes research, one pivotal moment was when I was working on a clinical trial or a clinical paper, actually, about hematopoietic stem cell transplantation in pediatric patients. And I saw a signal in the data that I didn't understand, and it didn't seem to fit with what we were trying to answer. And I queried it. And I was told, well, that's for our analysts. Don't worry about that. You're a medical writer. And I was like, what? I'm like, don't worry about it. If I don't worry about it, what am I writing about, right? So that was kind of interesting. And it started the long journey towards me going to getting an executive education certificate from Columbia School of Engineering in applied data science, because I really wanted to get that skill set where that wouldn't happen again, and I could be more independent. And it was a very Python heavy course, nearly killed me. I'll have you know, it was a long course. It was like 14 weeks, and I think I cried once in week 2, but I got over it. and then became, data monger, where I'm data monger Bonnie over on Twitter, and, really just unpacking some of the data that we take for granted and helping to share data literacy, because that's what's scalable. Me doing a bunch of data analytics for a bunch of different clients isn't helping. I mean, it's helping on a one by one, but that's not scalable. If I teach more and more people where the data is, how we can access it, how we can query it, and what the limits of that data might be, I feel like that's much more worthwhile. And before we move forward, I just have to let you know that I have a hound that is going to start hollering when the mail gets here. So I just want to let you know that it'll stop. But I thought I want to give you that like little warning beforehand. Now, a good thing to start thinking about, this just came to me when I was on a run. I'm an ultra runner, so I really just kind of keen with a bunch of podcasts and just go out and hit the trails. And most recently, I was listening to the Tim Ferriss show, and he had Graham, can't think of his last name, but he's coming up on another slide. And they were talking about the inquiry of Byron Katie, a woman who does this cognitive restructuring. And I thought, this really applies to how we need to look critically at data. When we're presented with something, is it true? How can we know that it's true? Is there a certain, opposing type of data that might challenge that thought? And where would we be if we didn't think this way? What are the limits of how we're thinking? And I like the little quote on the bottom there under the little cartoon guy. A thought is very harmless. You can think anything. Now, when we believe it and we become attached to it, that's when we can do some damage. So I think it's really important when we're looking for data, when we're working with data, that we take this into consideration. And, another thing, working as a data analyst, a lot of times people will show up and they'll say things like, okay, I want you to show me innovation in these pharmaceutical companies. Who are the top 10? And here's what I want you to measure. And I think to myself, it really doesn't work that way, right? You need to be able to hold attention. Like maybe what makes someone innovative makes them do harm in a certain way, right? You can do good, but maybe you need to do less harm too. And there's a tension that we have to be able to live with, especially in healthcare, because there's a lot of challenges that we need to hold close when we think of the cost of medicine, when we think about access in healthcare systems, who can access the medicine, who can't, right? There's a lot of limits, and that tension has to be okay. And I like the way Graham Duncan, the way he said, that tension is what gives you the vibratory notes, right? And you can play different notes in different contexts. And I thought that was probably the best way that I thought of to describe what it might be like when you're pulling data from multiple sources, well-informed data, and, maybe it challenges assumptions. I always have to stick this into anything, the logical fallacies, because we're human, right? We know that we sometimes think of anecdotal using our personal experience, especially if we're physicians or as a data scientist. But remember, data is plural, right? So we have to take that into consideration. And many of us, myself included, have been guilty of the Texas sharpshooter. The Texas sharpshooter is the guy who, shoots a barn, and there's a cluster of bullets, and he circles that to show his, efficacy at shooting. Well, we can get guilty of that as well when we go into these large data sets and we look for patterns without really a plan beforehand. And, you could go down this list and find a lot of things in the data world, but I'm not saying that you're going to eliminate all of these. What I am saying, though, is that we need a little bit of an awareness, because we can balance this out by maybe including different data in our inquiries. And to remind that also is, the Nobel Prize winners in behavioral economics, we're saying that we can make bad decisions. It's kind of part of our makeup. But maybe there's different techniques and data practices and data sourcing that we can do to guard against a lot of this, or at least to make us more aware. Now, take a second. I don't know if you can, how well you can see that. I just want to check. I got a text, and I think it's from somebody who's trying to get in and can't. Okay, we're good. So this, what I really love about this wheel, besides the complexity of it and the comprehensiveness, is it really alerts you to things like, we find stories and patterns even in sparse data. I'm a big storyteller. It's kind of what I do, but are you telling the whole story if you don't have all the data that you need? And there's lots of things, we look for details that confirm our own beliefs. We know this politically, but it also applies professionally as well. And this visual by Amona Chalabi, when she does data visualizations, she's not even computing them. She's drawing them out by hand. And her biggest motivator for doing this sort of work is to just always make sure the human element is front and center. The biases and the choices that we've made about how we display the data, how we choose the data, are perfectly flawed, and they're there for all of us to inspect and to be aware of. So often we begin with the end in mind. A lot of the projects that I do, I start with a sketchbook and we start talking about what we think the data would look like or what we're trying to say, because that also determines what data we try to find, right? And it seems like a weird way to start, but I've had people come up to me and say, I've seen these Sankey diagrams. I want one of those. I'm like, well, what question are you trying to answer? And what kind of data are we going to be looking for? Because sometimes you have to not be so emotionally attached to like what something's going to look like. You're really looking to answer a question. And you need to frame the problem and the question in a way first, and then we look to see if the data exists to answer the question. Now, if we're limited by data or the data doesn't exist, then we might have to reformulate our question. So these are all things that begin with sketching out a feasible analysis. And just a reminder of the types of data, because sometimes, this is how we can visualize the data depending on whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So by review, we have to know if something's binary, is the disease present, is somebody alive, is somebody pregnant, not pregnant. And then sometimes there's more than two choices and they're not really ordered. There's race, which can be kind of fluid. There's age groups that can shift based on ranges that are in the data. You can have more than two choices, stages of a cancer, the Likert scale for response, good old Likert. It is pronounced Likert, by the way. And then we move over to continuous data, more quantitative data, where, we have fractions, we have any value. These things can hold any value. It's a continuous. There could be intervals where the intervals between the measures have meaning, right, in a temperature, but the ratio has no meaning. So, whatever temperature you're using, because there's no zero has no value, because there's no zero temperature on most scales, or there's no absence of a temperature at all. So there's certain limits to certain types of measures that we look at. Now, a ratio between weight and height, some ratios of certain measures do have meanings that we can look at, and we can engender probabilities. This chart is very useful. I use it a lot too, depending on the kind of data I'm looking for, right? Sometimes you just want descriptive statistics. A lot of times behind the data that you're collecting, you're just going to want to look and see, what's the spread, what's the mean, what does this data look like, especially before you try to visualize it. That's always an important step, and we'll step through why that is really important as we move along. But this algorithm is a really interesting way to start thinking about what type of data gives you what information. Because a lot of time, especially with media reporting scientific data, you get lost in what the claims are. You know, the splashy headline can look really interesting, but then when you're like, wait a second, you know, we're not looking at that type of data. They really kind of did a little slippery slope there, or jumped ahead of what the data can tell us. So this is very useful. And as I mentioned, I'll be sharing these with you after. Now, when we get to the data, which we will shortly, what are we looking at? You know, sometimes when you look at data, we just kind of respond immediately, maybe empathetically, but we respond to what we see without thinking about what really is under the hood. Like when we look at something, what level of detail are we looking at? Are we looking at the person level? Are we looking at communities? Are we looking, you know, where are we? Where are we looking? What's the granularity? Because sometimes the claims aren't supported by the granular nature. You know, a lot of this is the, you know, what the new blockbuster drug now is, the patient, right? Patient-centered everything. But a lot of times we take that patient data and we aggregate it to such a high level, we've lost the patient, right? Observations, how many rows? What do we, you know, how many rows are in this, right? Those are the observations. That's what we call it when we look in R. The rows are the observations and the variables are the columns. You know, we like to have nice wide data sometimes when we're trying to look at complex variables or associations. What types of variables are here? You know, we just kind of went over that a little bit. Are they nominal, ordinal, interval, ratios? What are we actually looking at? What is the unique identifier or the key? You know, when we look at data, what is that one element that is unique for each row? Sometimes it's not what we think it is. So we have to dig a little deeper. And the quantitative variables, the shape, you know, a lot of times people don't think of the shape of the data until they're looking at a visualization. But what I like to do is look immediately at the shape, even if it's just a linear graph, because it'll show me if there's a big bucket of data missing. Maybe 10 years have gone missing, or maybe there's a certain type of thing, a gap, when I just sketch it out and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. You know, where'd that go? And is it relevant to what I can say? You know, the insights I can gather down the road. That's important to know. Are there different classifications of things like drugs? Sometimes they will go with the mechanism of action, and then within that there's certain drugs. So that leads into the hierarchies. You know, where are we? What level are we looking at the data? A really important thing, a lot of times, you know, I'm on calls where these missing values are just deleted, you know, out of hand. But we need to know, what are they? Are they zeros? Are they missing? Are they things that we can kind of make adjustments for? They're not, it's not all the same thing when you see a null or an NA. Sometimes there's a null because you're looking at population level data and it's male and female, and males can't get pregnant, so that whole, maybe that whole variable has generated a lot of nulls. Well, we need to figure all this out before we can garner insights. Now, this is, I'll show you, I chunked this out on the next slide. I'm giving it to you in this format, so when you get the slide, if you want to print it out, you can, but I cleaned it up here. And all this is kind of giving a little context to us, because all we hear about is data, big data, 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 data. What does this mean? You know, AI is going to take all of our jobs, and we got machine learning. So where is this in a contextual way? So I feel like they do a really nice job. This is the top half, the when, why, what. And it's really interesting to see what the traditional way and then what the big data way is. And big data doesn't mean, oh, wow, you have 30,000 rows. That's big. Big data is unstructured data. It's not going to come to you in a table with columns and rows and in that format. It's just, it's big. It's very messy data that we need to pull in, clean, organize, and find ways to interpret. So you can dig into this a little deeper, but what I like about it, and one of the reasons why I share it, besides, you know, showing the different steps in the pre-processing that's really common to most of these types of data, is right here. If you look down the middle, the how. What are the tools everyone's using? And if you look, those Tableau, Excel to a certain degree, obviously, because of the spreadsheet capabilities, but R and Python are there, SQL is there, MATLAB is there. And I'd say 98.9% of the things I like to share is open source. Because what's the point in talking with you and having conversations, whether they're from the podium or, more intimate in a workshop, in a webinar, is if you can't go and access these things, if the cost to entry to do some sort of analytic is so high that you're not going to be able to integrate it, what's the point? So if there's anything that I'm talking about that has a price tag, it's either super low or there's a free option, and I'll be sure to point those out. Now, I'll give you a minute to squint on this one. I hope you can see it, because what's really relevant here is the key at the bottom. Because what we're looking at here is structured data and unstructured data. Now, a lot of the work, one of my first big engagements was with when I had a client who he was noticing that all his data was being kind of siphoned off by like Blue Cross Blue Shield and other vendors. He had access to his data, but he didn't really have access to his data. So what happened in his EMR system was, if you wanted something out, you had to request a crystal report, and it could take anywhere from 2 weeks on up to get the report. But there were guideposts around what you could ask about your data. And then it became like a specialty thing at additional cost. And he was really frustrated. And he felt that, I'm sure there's got to be a way that we can get reports out of here. And really, all an EMR is a relational database. And you can query it with SQL. So what we did is we figured out how the data was stored. And we put a Tableau server, like an analytic layer on top of it, never touched or moved any of his data, and you can pull information out as you needed it. And he was able to create reports. He was a rheumatologist, so really important for him was, what if he wanted to know what drugs his patient had been on and for how long, what was first line, second line, third line, were they methotrexate naive, all these other questions he wanted. He could find this out once we created these extracts in Tableau. He was able to, at his fingertips, just answer any of these sorts of types of questions, which, as you can see, it moves beyond the administrative side of an EHR and makes it something very useful for the healthcare providers. Now, when you look here, the color codes at the bottom are really important, but it just describes the amount of data out there, right? The green shading is all the pharmacy data. And then you have claims data kind of in the purpley colors. The data outside of the healthcare system is yellow. That's called kind of silent listening. And I know a lot of pharma companies do silent listening to hear about how their drugs are doing post-market out in the wild. And there's registry data, clinical trial data, healthcare center, like the electronic health records that we were just talking about. And then you can look at, the data quality, they should have flipped that where the dark is to the right, but the darker it is, the more, the more data of that type is out there. So this is kind of really interesting just to kind of open our minds to how much is really out there swirling around. Now, this is important. I know it looks probably like, oh, it's that kind of webinar. No, but this is ANSCOM. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at the Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, these quartets are really buckets of data. Now, buckets of data that you see here with the X and Y, these are all different numbers, but what's really important is they have the same descriptive statistic. So these all have the same mean, which is telling you what the center of the data is. It has the same variance, the spread or the width of the data, and the same correlation. And, you may just think, well, descriptively, I guess that happens. But the interesting part is when you look at how the data is visualized, you can see why it is important to visualize the data, because clearly these are not the same based on their descriptive statistics. Because as you can see in Y1, the top left, We're looking at, we can see the linearity, we can see the normal curve, and we can understand why that correlation is what it is. Now, how about if we move to Y2 over there on the right? Well, there's some sort of relationship there, but it certainly isn't linear, right? And the way these dots have, the way they've arranged, they've generated the same correlation, but as you can see, that's not the same. And then you look at Y3, where that outlier is what pulled everything up to have the same correlation as the other two that we just looked at. And then we get to X4. I mean, that's really odd. We don't know what's going on here. There's no relationship. I mean, it's very interesting how it's arranged, but you could see how looking at data and sketching it out or generating a visualization gives you a lot more information. And so if you can have the same descriptive statistics, but what you need is the anecdotal evidence for context and visualization. So, it's all about how we visualize the data and how we're going to understand it. And, no talk for me would be complete without the Elvis toast. I used to have Jesus toast on there, but it just caused all kinds of controversy. So I switched to Elvis. In fact, one of my clients made one of these with my image on it. I thought that was hysterical, but we're not going to look at that. So now, as a data storyteller and a data analyst, I feel like there is a big difference. And we're going to see this when we start looking at types of data sets, but sometimes you can only tell the story based on the data set that you have in front of you, right? You can't really expand it to any other population. It's just a moment in time, a little snapshot. And it's about a data set. Now, when you go into data storytelling, it always links back to the origin. It's going to link back to that fundamental question that you began with. And what I like about the Elvis toast is, imagine you're having breakfast, you just put the toaster down and out comes a piece of toast with Elvis's face on it. And you're curious. You're thinking, what in the world? Does my toaster make Elvis toast? How are you going to test this hypothesis? Are you going to take the toast that you just made and stick it back in the toaster and then have it pop out, and that's going to confirm your hypothesis because the toast came out again with Elvis on it? And my point in telling this, it's usually a gentle reminder when I have clients or collaborative partners that have a data set where they generated a hypothesis, but then they want to go back into that same data set to confirm the hypothesis. And that's no bueno. So this doesn't mean you have to have vast amounts of data. It just means that maybe you split the data you have into two sets, right? So that you can query in one and confirm in another. Or, as we step through this, I hope what I make you aware of is there's a lot of different types of data that we can access. Now, and this goes back to the storytelling part, right? Your eyes may have rolled back into your head, but when you look at something like this, matrix factorization, without the story, you're kind of left with, oh no. But what this is, if you look at item bias and user bias, what matrix factorization is, it's the layer that kind of runs under, say, Netflix, for example. And terms like item bias, if you're looking at, say, Netflix, some movies just suck. They're not any good, right? So that's already item bias right there, right? Some movies are inherently better than other movies right out of the gate. And then user bias is going to measure us. Some of us are kind of salty. We're not going to give anything, we're hard to please, and we're not going to give anything its due. And when you look here at terms like the latent factor array, all that means is things like healthcare. Like healthcare is not a single measure. It's very complicated. So there's certain things you measure that there's not one single measure that does it. So you use like a latent factor array. Now that's just all fancy schmancy stuff to just show you that the story around matrix factorization is things like Stitch Fix that can kind of figure out things based on your personality and your likes and dislikes, how you might resonate on something. Do you like this shoe? Should they put that in your package? And Netflix, Sometimes I think they do a horrible job. I think I watched maybe 2 comedy specials that I really, really liked, and now everything's coming in. Here's something you might like. Well, no, not really. And Blue Apron is the food choice one, which you can pick your menus. And I just think that's interesting because when you take the math layer and add a story, it becomes relevant to people and people want to pay attention and understand. Or maybe I'm making a big assumption and you're all yawning. And machine learning algorithms, we hear machine learning. What's great about this is it a Chihuahua or a blueberry donut, right? So we train the algorithm to recognize, and then it comes back and it does it wrong. And we say, well, no, maybe we only want to see 3 blueberries in the muffin. And then you can say it might be a Chihuahua. So, our biases and our humanism go into those algorithms that we think are going to save us. But the problem is any sort of bias or mistake we put in there kind of gets exploded by the algorithm. But I just think this is hysterical, and I have to include it anytime I talk about machine learning. Some of them will fool you. Now, also, the lens I want you to have before we start looking at data as well is, I teach a lot of data literacy to physician audiences and people who really need to rely on their clinical and data literacy. And I used to put charts up there, and there'd be a hazard ratio, and I'd say, okay, who can explain the hazard ratio to me? And as you can imagine, no hands would go up. So I wanted to find a safe environment for us to have these conversations. And I found that art, everyone is willing to say, art, am I right? Who gets that? It's a much more comfortable way to start thinking about, what do you say when something's missing? Or, what do you see when something's just not right? So take a second to look at this, and then I'm going to step you through kind of the things that you should be seeing or that are of note. So a lot of times what I'll do is somebody will raise their hand, and I'll say, okay, you know what? Or I'll have some people don't turn and look at the overhead when this comes out. And so I asked the doctor once, I said, all right, describe to this this person, what do you see? And he was like, well, there's a train. It's a steam engine. There's smoke coming out of the top, and I'm like, that was it, done. And I'm like, well, you didn't mention that it's not on a track. It's coming out into a room. It's not all there, right? Because you can see some of the wheels are missing. The smoke is being pulled back up in the fireplace, and it's in a fireplace. It's casting a southwest shadow. You can kind of see the texture on the mantelpiece there. You see the clock at 12:45. You see the candlesticks, but only one is really reflected in the mirror. There's wainscoting. There's 15 boards here. There's the gold frame. There's just a lot of things to describe here that are missed if you go towards the thing that's the most attention grabbing. You can miss some of the context. And this is a Magritte, and I always like to use it because it's kind of funny how few people actually mention the tracks not being there, or that it's coming into a room elevated off the ground out of a fireplace. So here's just a quick list of some of the stuff that's there. But it's kind of interesting. There's a couple others that I do where a piece of a picture or something is missing or out of the ordinary. And it always amazes me what we put there, what our mind does when something's missing. It automatically fills it with something based maybe on our beliefs, our biases, and we just need to be aware. And we also need to bring in problems that are solvable with data. Sometimes the questions we hold or the tensions we hold, there is no data available. But most times, if we reformulate the question or we look for different types of data, we can at least start to refine the question. And this slide's a mess. It's by Datavant. It's not my slide, but I think it's just amazing to take a second to just look at how we're awash with companies that are collecting and selling data as currency. It's mind-boggling. And as you know, you might recognize some of these names here and know, like, I don't know about you, but my budget can't handle IMS data at $20,000 a month, or what a lot of these clearinghouses cost to be part of it. I'm fortunate that as a journalist, I get access to some registry data, and some people make the data available to me, because data without a story is just numbers sitting in a in a warehouse. So there is a little bit of that, but you can just see the large scope of data being generated in a way that I think is really, I don't know, I think it's really interesting how it looks when you see it all in one place, right? Now, having seen that vast amount of data, when do you start talking about the quality of the data that you're looking at? Like, this is kind of the riff on air quality. I mean, do you wait until the room is filled with smoke and things are burning to think about, like, oh, well, let's talk about air quality? So this is part of a data governance talk that I give, and I just think it's so relevant when we start looking at all the data that's out there. We hardly ever think about the quality of that data that we're pulling in. And as I hinted at with the Elvis toast, right, we have explanatory and exploratory analytics. Explanatory data is kind of, if your role might be, you have to generate a quarterly report, right? The data is being like hand delivered and you just have to make sense of it. You're doing maybe summary statistics, you're rendering, a report or some kind of regularly scheduled discussion around specific data. And then there's exploratory analytics, and that's kind of the side that I gravitate towards, when you're really creating like a data question and trying to query it and see what sort of data is out there, analyze it, and see, are you generating hypotheses? Are you confirming? It's just really important, because both are valid, but you don't want to look at an explanatory explanation and think it's exploratory, or vice versa, right? Because it might make you make assumptions that aren't valid. Now, this is, to me, is kind of interesting, because the Royal Statistical Society had a logo, the one on the left. And if you see the little banner across the thrashed wheat, it says, and the wheat was because in 18, it was this 34, I think it's 1834, yeah. The way the data was collected was like, well, how many bales of hay did you bring to market? I mean, it wasn't super sophisticated, but it evolved to be threshed out by others, is what the banner reads. And what it really meant was, we kind of create the data, right? We get the data, and then we just kind of hold it out there and say, here you go, what do you think? And as you know, it's not that way anymore. We have to make assumptions, we have to make decisions, we're gathering insights, we're making determinations. And that's really an important shift in the logo of the Statistical Society, the Royal Statistical Society, is that, we're going to interpret this a little bit for you. We're going to not just give you these numbers and leave you to your own devices. We're actually going to put some context around it. And I think that's really welcome and very important to realize the role we have when we are looking at numbers and statistics and making hypotheses. Now, this is a little snapshot, a little bit about, I did a data story that I presented in Raleigh about the opioid epidemic. And I just took a few slides out of that just to share how different data sourcing can help to inform a story. And it's always been pretty popular. So I wanted to share, those are the Sacklers in the background. And basically, hopping into one data source, which was the, what is this one? The physician payout one. You can look and see who's getting paid by which pharmaceutical company and how much. And this is above and beyond. You can look and see how much of it is for honoraria. It shows you how much of it is just gifts. And a lot of this has been revised. This is for 2017, but you can look and you could see, if you're the top doc there and you're getting $350,000 a year just to talk about a drug. We learned back from the Nobel Prize laureates around behavioral, economics, that can sway your behavior. There's a lot I would do for $350,000, let's be honest. But just looking about this side of the discussion, I think is extremely relevant. And there's a few other data sources that kind of show. Now, we always see the descriptive statistics about the opioid prescribing rate, and we have so much opioid. But I wanted to kind of shift it and say, well, where is it above the national average, right? Because there are bona fide and justified reasons for prescribing an opioid. Well, the little red buckets are where it's above the national average. And I believe I zip coded this data. So this is back to that slide where we talked about granularity, right? Now, when you roll these up into states or sometimes even counties, you don't see the granularity where you can go in and say, wow, there's things happening here that are a little more interesting that we could dig into. And I don't just mean this about opioid or prescriptions in general. I'm just saying the aggregation of the data is really important. And, going into data for the International Narcotics Control Board, it was very interesting to me that, we don't grow opium legally in the States for our use, but we have medical use and it's got to be grown somewhere. And if you look at tables like these, they tell you, well, what's the acreage? How much of it is being dedicated towards opium and who's growing it? And it's a really interesting shift to see how acreage shifts in different countries during different times. And, I was able to get a lot of insights from this table. And I'll show you how you can scrape data and get it out of a PDF and things like that so that you can do analyses as well, because I think that's really important when you find a data source that's interesting, that's not available as a CSV export or something that you can pull into a spreadsheet. What other things can you do? What other tools might help you? And it was kind of interesting, watching the shift in opioid production coming out of places like Afghanistan. I mean, they have no infrastructure, clearly. But we're looking at how they're funding things, and a lot of it's through their opium production. And you can see here, I may have this on my Tableau Public where you click it, the years, and it just kind of shows the change over time. Unfortunately, I lost a lot of the developed Tableau visualization from this. I don't know where it went, so I couldn't share that with you here. But the important thing is just to look at heroin and morphine and look at opium and just look at the difference between the produced product and the opium that's out on the market, and looking at where you could see where it's concentrated. And what happens on this, these are drug seizures. This is what's discovered and confiscated on the black market out of these countries that are, some of them are growing it legally. And you can shift between the region. Over here, you can look and see, you can pick different regions that you want to look at, different years, and you can actually look at the troop downsizing and upsizing, and look at what influences the opium market. It's just a different level of data and granularity to look at. And then we look at morphine equivalents, milligrams per capita, right? That's the way we measure, because as you know, all of these different drugs are dosed differently, especially fentanyl, which is dosed, per hour, not per day. So you have, you have a lot of different types of milligrams that are being, so they use a morphine equivalence that can rank these and make them more comparable. And that's what you see here. And the year also shows the oxycodone is starting to come down, right? This is opioid consumption. And what consumption means is not like people are throwing this down their gullet. This is what's being provided at the retail level. And so when you're doing some analytics on opioids, you have to know what the opioids are. So this, I updated this. This may not even be the most recent thing, but when you go in to look at claims database, or you're going in by ICD-10 code, or you're going in and looking at in the CMS data, you have to be able to pull all the different brands and generics and equivalents out to be able to say something meaningful and accurate. So these are some, I pull this in just so people can see different places to look if they want to join that conversation. Now this, I picked Nevada because everyone's always picking on Vegas. So I figure I'll join in. But basically, this is basically the shelf inventory. This is what's distributed to hospitals, pharmacies, the retail drug market, teaching institutions, narcotic treatment programs. This is the amount of drug that's being provided. So these are things people don't really talk about. They're talking about pretty much, the stuff being pulled off, with drug dealers or people that are addicted without even looking at the contextual part of it. That's, in my opinion, very relevant. And this is just a little snapshot. You can go state by state by state, and you can actually visualize this pretty readily as well, the different drugs. And this one was very interesting to me because this is the amounts distributed to the retail level. And although it only goes up to 2015, when it's live, I think this came from Gapminder, or I don't know, it might be on the Tableau Public page that I made. But what happens, if you notice, this, I stopped it here and made a screenshot of it because you can even look in 2015, look how much more drug is being distributed to US. And this is per capita, so it's already been adjusted, so it's kind of amazing to see how much is coming to the US to begin with, to be distributed at the retail level. Maybe that's a good place to start to find out, what might be going on. Because if you look at India and Pakistan and some of the places that legally, I'm not sure what their status is now, but were cultivating this for us. I mean, look how much of it they actually distribute on their retail level. Is there less pain in these countries? I don't think so. So it's just an interesting way to look at different sources of data and what it tells you. And this is prevalence of drug use between the opiates, the opioids, and prescription opioids. They're all colored by, you can see them on the map. It's kind of interesting where the U.S. is, and the prevalence of use. And the blue, the prescription opioids, are there on the U.S. They're just dwarfed behind the bigger opioid. And these are just visualizations that were made in Tableau. And this one is the Social Vulnerability Index, which I find absolutely fascinating because they rank these by household composition and disability, which is very important because an area of expertise for me is removing race as a variable that we use poorly, right? We use it to describe as a poor biologic proxy, which it is very poor. If you want to say something different physiologically according to race, then you need to name what that is. Is it lung function, some kind of metabolism thing? You name it. You don't roll it all up into an aggregate like race. If you mean the social construct or political construct of race, well, then name it, right? You can't just say poverty. Like a lot of times, one of the measures I see in a lot of the studies I look at is house ownership. Well, it's great to own a house or to live in a house, but if there's 8 of you in a 1-bedroom house, that's a measure that has a different validity based on how you interpret it. So the Social Vulnerability Index, I think, does a good job of distinguishing between different sorts of socioeconomic variables. And this is 2016, but I've actually recreated it privately for a client, where I went in and sourced the data and updated it for like 2018. So These are things that you can do. You can see things like this and then go into the data dictionary, find out how they built it, and then you can update it. Because as you know, a lot of these things are not updated maybe as frequently as we'd like them to be. But this looks at socioeconomics, household composition, disability, minority status, and language, housing, transportation. And this is the overall index. So when you see the red, the orange, the higher themes are where this is more of there's more vulnerability. And I think I broke this down into zip code as well, because sometimes you can just, a whole state will be a certain color, but then when you get down into the granularity, you see pockets, right? And those pockets are the relevance. And these are all in the same. One thing I really liked about this, you've noticed, and I haven't, this is just me making a hypothesis, but if you look at the ranked by minority status, you can see that it's not as orange as the others. It's not as linked. And all of these measures can kind of stand alone and inform policy, health status, when we want to talk about social determinants of health. A lot of these things are correlated differently. And I just like this because of the granularity and the awareness. There's a really important white paper. I should share it with you. It's by Roger Peng, and I love Roger Peng. He's got a couple great podcasts that he does about data. And I have a soft spot because he was my first foray about years ago into hardcore data analytics was taking one of his Coursera courses from the Johns Hopkins, and it was tough. But it really started my pivot to thinking more on a data level. But the white paper described him and his podcast partner, who I think she's one of the lead data scientists over at Stitch Fix. They were trying to create a data project from the ground up. And it wasn't really relevant to our discussion, but it was about, I think, transportation time, of how they got to work. But it was really interesting. And you could pull it up if you're interested, just from this title and his name. And they just go step by step, what assumptions they made, what assumptions could remain. Some things weren't valid. Do we track how we go to work, or do we track how we come home from work? Because on the way to work, maybe I'm picking up my dry clean. Like they were just really making these assumptions that seem that they're only relevant for that particular data question. But when you dig a little deeper and you think about it, you realize it's applicable to any sort of a data question. Now, this book here, I do, this is funny. This is actually a textbook, so don't look at it and say, I'm going to pick this up for my nightstand. It's an investment. I was lucky. I do a lot of peer review in data models, in shared decision making, and the way we don't get paid to do reviews for Picori or some of these other places, but what they'll do is they'll give you periodically like a little gift, an Amazon gift card or something. So I collect the gift cards, and then when they add up, I treat myself to a textbook. I know I'm that fun. But this is a really good one. Like if you really want to get one instead of three, and you want just this is great, but it's down to the brass tacks, but it's really good about analysis and design. And what I liked a lot about it is this particular chart, because it really talks about data types, data and data set types in a way that lets you kind of build something up from a framework. And in the textbook, they go over the what, the why, the how in greater detail. But I really like this slide because it really shows how the tables and the networks and the fields and continuous variables. It's very interesting because when you understand how the data kind of moves and how it lives underneath something, it makes Tableau data visualization easier because you know whether some's a dimension and a measure and how you can slice it. It works really well in R because you know what kind of functions to call. Same thing in Python. So it really is I think of it like you can learn Spanish in school for like 5 years, or you can go to Spain for a summer, right? And this is kind of like the Spain for a summer approach to learning data. And this is something else. If you go to FT, this is Financial Times vocabulary. I think they even offer this as a poster, and I don't even think you have to pay for it, but it's on my wall because it's really interesting when you're coming up with data questions, when you're thinking like, gosh, I have this data question, but what am I really looking for? Am I looking for correlation? Am I trying to rank things? Is it a part to whole or a spatial? Am I looking for change over time? All of that is extremely relevant when you're looking for certain types of data. You need to know what's your visual vocabulary? Like, what are you actually looking to measure? Because if you look, this is telling you what types of visualizations are the visualizations that can display that. And from that, you can look at the attributes and the lists and the types of variables. And then from that, you kind of know what type of data to go hunting for. Does that make sense? So now there's something called Makeover Monday, which I recommend. I don't know. I didn't poll or do any of that. I probably should have. Um, what your interest level is in these sorts of things. But what's really important, this is free. It uses Tableau. So if you're into Tableau or you want to be, you can start wherever you are with this, and you go into Makeover Monday. And the good part about it, and Data World hosts this for Makeover Monday, they clean the data for you. Let me see. I think we can click into this. I think I put a link on this for us. Yeah. So if we go into here, you all the data sets are absolutely clean, and you just pick one. You can go along with them and you could participate. Here's the data sets right here. I just picked one, the Digital Economy and Society Index, which we'll see in a minute. I never submitted it, but I just went in because I wanted to work with clean data and I wanted to be able to show it to you. So you can just go in, get a data source, download it, and start playing around with it, because Tableau Public is free. If you just go to tableaupublic.com, you could just open up your own account. The other thing is you wouldn't take your marketing, your medical affairs data and trot it out in Tableau Public, because you can't protect it. But something you can do, suppose you're a little data shy and you don't want to share it with the world, you can make it unsearchable, but people can still find it. But it gives you a little layer if you're a little shy around it. But and you can go back all these years and look at all this different data that's available to until you find a topic maybe of interest to you. And there's a lot of medical stuff in here too. So let me get out of here and get back to the presentation. This is the part that always scares me. And so this was the original visualization. So just remember this, because I'm going to show you how I revisualized it, but I think it's kind of peppered throughout our conversation. So the original, visualization just showed up like this, right? They just wanted to look at the Digital Economy and Society Index, trying to find out ranking countries on their maturity, their IT maturity, I guess is a good way of thinking about it. And it's a spreadsheet. Now think about what you can. This is just a snapshot of the top rows in the spreadsheet. And we'll come back to what that looks like, but I wanted to introduce you to some of the tools, like tidy tools, like tidy data. All that means, it's a goal that we all have with our data. So what tidy data is each variable is a column. I know it sounds very common sense, but when you look at a data set, take a look. You're going to see that a lot of times that's not the case. Each observation is a row, and each type of observational unit is a table. So we're not mixing together different types of ideas and measures and things, because with all the tables and the observational units being separate, we can use tools like tidyr, dplyr. These are all R tools, ggplot. Python, there's lots of pandas is the Python one. These are great packages that are free, and you can pull them into R or Python and start querying data like on day one. And we're not going to get too heavy into that, but I want to show it to you so you know it's out there, because there's a lot of resources that can help you. Now, this is a hatching Python. This is what I like this one, because even though I spent the last 4 months like intensive working in Python, I still feel like a novice, and I feel like we all do. And I was kind of surprised that even when I was working with the Columbia School of Executive Education program, things are not like neatly tied with a bow. There's lots of code that they would give us and it wouldn't work. And they'd be like, oh, wow, I guess they updated the API and it doesn't work with this version of Python. You needed to be able to go and solve your own problems. And it's always going to be that way. So I like to think of myself as that little guy. Although it looks like he's got gold dripping out of his egg. So wait, I got to get back. Wait a minute. There we go. I had to go back because the little hyperlinks won't work if I get out of it. This is the Healthcare Cost Institute, and I use this as an example. This is really good data as well to look at costs, because I know a lot of times we want data sets that can give us costs, longitudinal costs, things like that. And I pulled this in because you have to go into the field names, the field ID in these data sets. It's very fun to just go in, oh, look, they export as a CSV and go nuts. But the problem with that is you may not know what the data is, and you can't really code it correctly if you're not sure. So always going into a data dictionary whenever you go into a publicly available data set is important, because not only does it tell you what information is there, it gives you the limits to how it was collected, whether it was weighted, meaning like, you can look at data as, male, female, but if you're not weighting it to how many females are actually in a population or in a community, you could distort the data, right? So weighting kind of makes it applicable to the population you're examining. So these are just field IDs. And what's good about this particular data dictionary is it tells you the data type, right? You're looking at a string, a character, an integer, because a lot of times when you pull data into like Tableau or Tableau Prep, or even into like R or Python, you're going to have to change the data type because it's not going to be reflected correctly. Like, for example, I always make my years as strings, which they have here. But sometimes some programs pull it in as a number. And what are you going to do with a bunch of numbers of dates, right? It's not going to let you look at it in the way you need to. And you can rename these once you get in. I just wanted to show you that data dictionaries are a thing. They're in every publicly available data source. And it also helps you hide the ones you're not particularly interested in to help with your data analytics. And, this is a tool, Anaconda Navigator. If you're not, when you're doing some type of coding to clean up the data that you're going to find, or if you're doing coding at all, I like to have a nice, pretty workspace. Now, a lot of people just go right into the terminal. Like on my Mac, I can just type raw code into a terminal and stuff happens. But sometimes you want to have a neat little notebook where you can keep things, where you can share things. And you'll see an example of the notebooks in, I just picked R and Python, but within the Anaconda Navigator, you have both of those tools here. And it's kind of a neat, and it's all free. It's all free. Jupyter Notebook is where your Python would live, although you can pull other things in there. I use the Jupyter Notebook for Python and RStudio for R, but I'm sure there's reasons for doing things other ways. This is the example of what a Jupyter Notebook looks like. Now, the HCCI price utilization data, this is what I pulled in from that HCCI where we were looking at the data dictionary. So that data was in there. I didn't know anything about it, right? It's just data that was listed in the data dictionary with all those headings. If I just want to look and see if this data is even something that is important for my data question, I can just import pandas in the top row. If you're in Python, you just write import pandas as PD. That's just telling you to bring in the software that can help read the data frames, and then you ask it to list it, and it tells you these are all the headings right here, the service type, the category. So now I know what I have to deal with. And when you plot it out, you can see, what categories are there. The most important thing here that I think is the output there, because you have some descriptive statistics. And what I think is really important is the top row. I guess I should be pointing at things. This top row here, I use this for my shape of my data. And this takes, once you're used to it, it takes less than 5 minutes to pull all this stuff in. But what's really important is you see the 320, the count across the top. The count is the same across. So now I know that I'm not missing data. A lot of times, suppose it said 320 all the way across, but the price was, say, 287. Well, then I know right off the bat I'm missing some data in those columns, and I need to kind of interrogate a little deeper and find out why that's not entered. Are those, is that information I can include? Do I need to, really investigate that null, or that why was that not entered? Sometimes there's, reasonable reasons for it being missing, and you need to adjust for that. Another really interesting thing with Python is a spacey tool. We are all talking about sentiment analysis, text analysis. This is one that I did with, you just take a little snippet of text. My business need was I was taking press releases from pharmaceutical companies and doing text mining about the different types of words that were used in the press release. So, but this is a more agnostic one. This is an introduction to text mining. And it just shows you how, seriously, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code. Now you do have to import the things, but it's just a matter of writing import. And the biggest learning curve is making sure that the packages and the things that you're calling are in the same folder so they can see each other. But that's not, if you think about it, that's not as technical as you might imagine it would be to do something like this, where you can actually label different types of words that are in a document. And this is kind of just like text mining 101, right? Looking to see what organizations are mentioned, what dates are in there, what language is this in, are there people mentioned? That sort of thing is very interesting in terms to understand what kind of text you're doing. And this can be very relevant for social listening if you're in pharmaceuticals and you want to go pull in some, text from a public forum. And we're returning back and bringing in problems that are solvable with data. And this is more data curation, where I'm going to try to pop in and out and just show you different data sources here. And I don't want you to get lost trying to, write down what is what, because like I said, I'm going to send this presentation to you. And you will also have, I'm going to add a slide at the end that's going to have the links to all of these little hotspots here. So now I always like to begin, I don't know how many of you are in medical education, continuing medical education or anything like that, but a lot of times people don't know where to start with a question, especially in healthcare. I'm assuming you're all in healthcare because that's probably where you would have found me, but maybe not. But anyway, so ICER it's extremely important. It's clinical and economic review. And the reason this is important because, whenever we're talking about a therapeutic state or we're trying to formulate a question, it's all about value, especially nowadays in today's climate. And because I work so much in health economics and health policy, and clinical medicine, I realized that it's like a three-legged stool. You know, you can't go to the physician at the point of care and just tell them the mechanism of action of a drug and think it's going to be high value. There's lots of other considerations that have to be made at that point of care, right? So I always like to keep ICER up front and center. When I used to do a lot of work years ago in grants, developing grants or needs assessments, this was always a great place to start. And I think I can click and we can get into it, and I'll just show you around really quickly. So if you look in here, the types of things that are here in their materials library, oh, here, let's just look here, because I know it's not opening. But you can go into different topics like depression. And there's meetings, there's going to be data, there's the one I just had, completed assessments. So now if you go in here, you can look up any of these assessments, and you're going to be able to look at the economic and the, like here's a good one right here. So they're doing this white paper is relevant, and I swear a lot of people likely haven't read it, but it's extremely relevant because it talks about, it's a comprehensive paper on the diagnostic testing. So they're doing all the evaluation for you. They're telling you, was there value in this? What was the medical? What did they come out with? What were the outcomes? This is a great place to start when you're trying to create a question in a therapeutic area, maybe that your company is invested in, or you're trying to get funding for to have some medical education. This is a very comprehensive resource to look and see the research that's been done from a value perspective, an economic perspective, and a clinical perspective. So back in the day, and even now that I've seen, people just pop into PubMed, do a cursory search, try to find some data that already exists, that was gathered, maybe physician surveys that are probably 4 or 5 years old, that are limited by the survey design, which we're going to talk about briefly towards the end. But it's just really important to have a resource to go to make these compelling arguments and to make sure that the foundation to your query is sound. And they've already done the work, and it's high quality work. So let's see. And now back to the data thing, Kaggle. If you're looking for healthcare data resources, Kaggle has a bunch. So let's see if we can click in here. I'm new to all that. A lot of these things I don't use yet now. I used to. So I pulled them all together just to show you. So that's why I have a limited portfolio in these. Let's see. So anyway, I don't know, it must have signed me out. Let's look at data sets. See if it'll let me look at data sets without signing in. Yeah. So like heart disease, right? You can look in heart disease, and there'll be data sets here that you're able to access. And these are, and they're all, and they'll tell you similar data sets that you can look at. I mean, really it helps you to flesh out your perspective, because, you know, how many times are we trying to write something compelling or talk about a need or have some awareness, and we only really have, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But this gives you a lot. So this is a really interesting resource for data sets that I wanted to share, because I've popped in here when I'm looking for something that I want to add to a data story. And you can do searches and everything. It's not just limited to what you see here. This comes up based on what I've looked at in the last probably 3 months. So Kaggle's good for that. These are all free. I just want to keep reminding you of that. Now, Data World, this is where they hosted the Makeover Monday work, but they also host data sets here as well. And I'm trying to think, what do I want to show you? Oh, here, down here. So all these different types of data, so you can find a data source that you're interested in, right? Rat sightings in, or whatever you're interested in, and then you can look at all the visualizations that were made around that data. So that's a really interesting, because the right here, because I don't really use this as a resource, but if you look, you can search data world. Like suppose, let's see here's one I looked for, behavioral risk factors. So now I'm looking at heart disease and stroke prevention. I have a CSV here that you can download, you can explore. Some of these have tools where you can actually visualize within the platform as well. And then they show you all the related data sets, especially if you want something a little more current. You can look at the cardiovascular disease surveillance. I mean, these are all data sets that you can go into, look at, visualize, and come up with something more timely and informed than if you were just going to do like PubMed or what people are doing nowadays. So Data World is another great resource. Google Dataset Search. This was something that I'm not really a Google person. I mean, I like the Google, but I don't use the documents and all that, although they're wonderful. I'm telling you, they're real. You can just write code right into your spreadsheet and pull data in from the internet just by writing import CSV or import Excel and putting parentheses around a link to a CSV document, and it'll pull it all into your spreadsheet. So you missed what I did. What I did that last window, what I wrote in, you can see up here under where the little thing is, I wrote claims data and just hit enter, and then it generated this page. So look at, there's all different types of claims data here that you can look at depending on what your different need is, sample insurance, TSA, all of these data sets are for you. And look how easy was that, just to go to Google Dataset Search and enter something. Yeah. You probably could even enter like questions that are less specific and come up with really good places to start. And what I tend to do is I go looking in here to see if these are really, and then I save these. I save different data sets in a folder so that I always have access to these when I have to come up with when I'm coming up with a data question. So here's Medicare Part D claims data. And here it is pulled up again. I had some backups here because sometimes it gets glitchy and it doesn't load. But these are all different sorts of places to look at this sort of data. Because a lot of people say they can't access it. Well, you can. It's freely available. You have to know a little bit about how to get it, but that's claims data that you can. And I'm going to show you just a little bit about how to do that in a few slides. Now, I don't know if this is going to load or not, but this is really important too. This is the FDA adverse event reporting system, because a lot of times, if somebody wants to talk about pharmacovigilance, maybe, and they want to talk about immunotherapy, or they want to talk in cardiology, or, a good place to start with learning. And I didn't include this in here, but I also have, what is that? I can't think of it. When patients are harmed, there's a big database that you can look there too, because where else are you going to look to see where knowledge might need to happen around where outcomes have not been so great, right? So, but this quarterly data file, let's see if we can open this up. Depends on how many people are in it, whether it'll actually open or not. But it's the public dashboard. I got a rainbow. Look at this. Oh, it's opening. So now if you try to do this and it doesn't open, you just come back in 2 seconds and it'll open just fine. And they always have you accept. But these are all the reports that you can get to, right? These are all adverse events. They're not all deaths. They're about, adverse events, some of them serious, some of them not. It's, you can decide whether you want last 10 years or since 1968. It's really, really interesting data. You can do this by report type, by reporter, a reporter being like the healthcare, the consumer. What's kind of interesting here is you see the healthcare professional is reporting more and more of these than before. And what's kind of interesting too, which look how like few problems we had back in 1998. And then like, whoa, obviously there's a lot of reasons for but it's very interesting to see who's reporting it. What about the regions? If you wanted to report by region, what would that look like? Our domestic obviously is going to be big, but these are all numbers that can go right into a spreadsheet. And seriousness. So, as you can see, death is a small part of most of, well, that's not small, but if you think about, how most of this is serious or non-serious, this could be a place to look as well. What drugs? Because you can query specific, it has a search part right here. Like suppose, let me see if it'll do this. Yeah, let's just look at oxycodone. Let's look at, okay, and let's just hit go. And it gives you, the death cases, how many cases there were, the serious cases. And this also shows that you have to be really careful about how you're pulling the data because the way they record it is important. So this may look low to you, because it's just oxycodone. It's not it's oxycodone and acetaminophen, but you have to look at all the other formulations. And if you pull all that in, I think I showed it to you when I stepped you through the opioid chart, is you would see that in here. But this is I think this is a very relevant tool that I wanted to make sure that I made you aware of because I use it all the time. And I just put this one in just in case we couldn't get that to load because like I said, sometimes the public dashboard is overwhelmed and you'll never make it in. So I just wanted to show you the different categories here. Like there's death, toxicity, wrong technique, and product usage. There's like 10,000 cases. I mean, what a great place for education to happen, right? Like what's going on there? Dig a little deeper. This is how you can specifically identify and try to get funding. If you're in medical education and you're trying to get support to do certain medical education, you can go into the specific areas of the drugs maybe in that therapeutic area and find out what's happening. Is the drug ineffective? Was it a product quality? Was it a pain issue? Is this a drug that's likely abused? What was it? What about the comorbid drugs that it's look the second one, toxicity to various agents. This is a very very important and useful database. Now, Medra, there is a cost associated with Medra, but I think it's like, if I remember correctly, like $200 a year. So, I mean, it's not cost prohibitive, right? And when you're looking at a particular drug, this will identify the chemical moiety. So wherever that chemical moiety exists, you can trace it and get the granularity to figure out like where the tox. This is all what I use. I do a lot of pharmacovigilance reporting. So once the drug's gone to market, what do we know and what do we don't know? I just did I'm working on a project where we're looking at the top immunotherapy cancer drugs that are going head to head. And one has done a better marketing branding approach than the other. And so we're looking into pharmacovigilance. So I would look at the FAERS data. I would certainly look at Medra data. Definitely looking at compensatory data in like who is paid what. There's just a lot of different avenues to try to create a story or a conversation. It's just a thought, not a belief. It's a thought, and I try to inform it with as full of a data set as I can. Many of you may maybe heard of IPUMS. This is a great place to go. I've used it for control group information, or if someone's making a claim in maybe a phase 3 clinical trial, I try to look and see how representative that trial population might be in the real world. And so sometimes you can go into a data site like IPUMS. Let me go in here because it's census data that is, wait, I got to come out so I can get my cursor to work again and then go back. Oops, that would be terrible. So now I can click. And first of all, look at all the categories. This is free. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, you know, maybe you all use this all the time. I don't know, but I think it's great. There's the Census Bureau data updates because people don't realize out of the decennial, every year the American Community Survey happens. And I have a link to that as well that we'll go through, but briefly, because we're starting to roll back on time. But there's health surveys, there's global health, there's US data, the current population surveys, international. There's just so much useful information here that you can use around the population. And you can even pull in like some health data as well. And I think, in fact, I actually did a talk in February for Black History Month. There's actually 1850 and 1860 census slave data that I did a Tableau data visualization around. And it was very interesting because it really brought to life a time and a accounting system and a national discussion around like where were the slaveholders, how many slaves did they have, were they corporate slaveholders, personal, family. I mean, lots of considerations that I wouldn't have known anything about. Let's just take a brief pop into here because I know there's a few more I want to show you before we go. You can analyze data online, or you can just pick stuff, you know, that you're interested in. Let me see what they have. Like, yeah, here's enumeration forms. Enumeration is when slaves were freed. I mean, who knew that data was like topical and easily to get? Let's see. I'm trying to find something. And they have webinars that are really good. Let's just look really quickly at this, just so you know what it's going to look like when you go in there. So, you know, they just tell you, you can pick your year, you can pick your variables. They'll tell you what variables down by county. And what you do here is you pick your data. And so now are you asking patient level, you know, individual data? Or are you looking at household data? So if you're looking at person data, you go under person. Are we looking at demographics, health insurance? So if you go into health insurance, just give a click. And now look here. Just a few variables for your consideration. But all you need to know is what the variable is, right? And you can look, the X's across the top tell you what years the data is available. And then you can scroll down and this guides you, right? You need variables and you need to create samples. So we don't really have time to go through exactly how to do this, but you can reach out to me, and that may be something that we're planning to do soon, is to just kind of take a data question, like maybe put out a poll, find out what data question people are most interested in, and then just really take it in from how we write the question, how we get the data. So this would be a step, how we clean it, you know, maybe something a little more linear. But the purpose here is to just kind of show you everything that's out there. And you can look at public health, you can mix these, get a couple. And this is not going to be at the individual level. Obviously, it's the population level, but it's also extremely, extremely interesting when you can drill down and look at some of these. And then you can do your own query here. Let me just show you what the household looks like. You can do geographic, dwelling characteristics, household composition, historical data going back to, you know, I like it because it's a little more intuitive, I think, than just going right to the census data. But both IPUMS and the census data have discussions about how to use the data. So they don't just leave you out there in the wild on your own. But this is a very important resource for lots of questions, whether it's around the health. Here's the slave data right here. They have linked samples right here, slave samples from 1850 and 1860. And obviously, as technology has changed, they inform you about that. So you know what the limits might be of what years you can include in your data. Now, clinicaltrials.gov might be a place that you haven't really thought of to use. Um, but I have to tell you, it's been extremely, extremely interesting as a resource. I'm trying to find out, there was one that I really thought was really interesting that I want to share. What study was that? Oh, studies by topic. Just to show you, I mean, look at this. And, you know, in a lot of these areas, if you go into them, let's see if we can do something like this. Now, it can tell you how many studies there are. Like, so suppose you are going to try to suggest an education program in cancers and neoplasms. Where do you think a lot of the interest is going to be and where the data is going to be coming out, like in force? I think adenocarcinomas, right? So, and you can go and depending on the phase of the clinical trial, they have to report their data. If it's NIH funded, it has to be reported. So you can actually even go in and see snapshots of the different types of data that are available. But this is a very good resource, and they also have very good download and searchable. I used this most recently to find out how much NIH funded how many clinical trials were I was looking at innovation, right? I think I mentioned that earlier. And you can look at innovation as, are we doing R&D? Are we bench scientists in our organization? Or are we doing mergers and acquisitions? So I looked a lot at the clinical trial R&D level. And this data set allowed me to answer some of those questions. So it's extremely interesting. And there's more here that I could show you. If this is an area that you're interested in, please reach out. Okay, what do we have here? And report is really cool too if you want to see where that research is happening. So the way these tools work, just really quick, like you can go into categorical spending and find out the estimates of where the money's being spent. So you can look at forward year thinking, which I think is really interesting because it kind of gives you a little bit of forecasting ability in terms of where you might want to be going with your data question. Or if you're a writer and you need to write about things that are timely and you're looking for a story, or if you're a medical director or somebody in medical affairs, these are all extremely useful resources, and you can export right here, right to Excel. But you can see this is like a rabbit hole you could spend like a long time in. But I think a lot of people aren't really aware that the reporter is out there and the kind of information that it can share with you. And it can actually tell you what types there. We're looking at RPGs, what are the types of research project grants, or if you work in a hospital and you do a lot of funding. I was very fortunate. One of my first jobs in medical writing as a job, like a job, W-2 job, was working in a health system where I worked for a cardiologist in internal medicine. And at that time, he was the highest funded investigator ever at the NIH. And I worked with him to write his grants. So I learned a few things. So really understanding, how these grants are put together, using data like this is a lot more relevant than, just going out and looking at published resources. And there's a part for all of it. It's all part of the conversation. It's a 360 perspective that might inform you in a different way. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Holding two tensions, more than two tensions, having something be a thought and not necessarily a belief. Maybe you think one way about a disease state and then you see some of the research and you're like, huh, and you're okay with holding the tension and then really finding the data to inform. And here's the American Fact Finder. I don't think we need to jump into this one, but you can see just by going here, this is actually, you'll have a link to this because you can go in here and start looking around as well. There's economic characteristics, there's the social characteristics that you can select. I mean, here, let me just show you one. I think we'll be all right. There's just so much. There's just so, I mean, I apologize for, there's just so much. This is just kind of a place to start, and I'm relying on maybe hearing from you after, like, hey, you know what, this is something I'd like to see in a little more detail. But when you talk about finding data, I think you can tell, it's not just a matter of going out finding things. I mean, I hope that some of these resources I'm pointing out to you are extremely helpful, but a lot of the front matter is equally important because it helps guides you to what type of data you should be looking for. I mean, look at this. These are all household types, relationships, fertility. I don't know how that got in there. Educational attainment. This is the type of data we should be looking at when we're asking questions around cohorts of populations. You know, beyond like origin, you know, where you're from, your ancestry is where your genes are relevant, not, you know, the color of your skin, which means nothing, you know, biologically. There's no, you can't put people into buckets based on their like melanin concentration, but you know, genes sort across populations. So that's extremely important. And the data here is pretty up to date. I mean, it's 2017. So I hope you'll use this as a resource. And what else do we, what's coming up? We already looked at this stuff before, the claims data. Did we? Let's just do a quickie. I don't want you to miss out. Yeah, this is pretty cool. Like this is just like this is all the claims data across topics, right? All of it. I think I can show it to you better in a visualization that I have, but I just want you to see, it shows you the columns, the column name, the description, all of that, which is extremely relevant. My God, who thought 2 hours wouldn't be enough to get through? The Wonder database, this is phenomenal. This is so deep. I'm going to leave this off. Oh, no, I can't. How much time do we have left? I think we have time. This is part of healthdata.gov, which you've probably heard of. But what's so great about this is, look, you can go state, health, quality, community, the different data sets that are available. Meningococcal disease. There's one here I just looked at, electronic health record payments. I mean, this gives you a whole different side of the kind of data that you can look at. You can go down to the state level. I mean, it's just phenomenal, all this level of data that we have at our fingertips that we don't even know. HCUP fast stats is really good. And what's really good about them is you can actually go to the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. I don't know how often they do it, but they do training on their data because they want to be relevant. They're funded through the government. So if they can't demonstrate relevance, they go away. So I've spent maybe 2 workshops there where they take you through how to use their data. All the data is not freely available, but if you have a research question, and they'll give you access to the data. And I'm guessing, but I really feel like even if you had to pay, we're talking like hundreds for like a data pull. You have to be specific about your data pull, and then they can kind of price it for you. But there are a lot of fast stats that are actually available just for the asking, like these here. Like inpatient. Here's one I clearly have looked at before because it's highlighted. But if you wanted to look at opioid hospital use maps, right? You want to see where's everybody in the hospital, like Florida, and then you can weight this and find out, is this because this is where they have substance abuse facilities and there aren't any over the border? I mean, there's lots of different questions that you have to say or think about before you can just come up with, but these are the emergency department visits here. which is kind of interesting to do an overlay of this with the naloxone, prescriptions. It's really, there's just endless things that you can do inside of HCUP. And like I said, it's not all available to you. Some of it is through my subscription, but there's a lot of stuff from a resource perspective that you do have access to. So let's just click through. I want to make sure that I'm not. And this is kind of a fun one, but you can play around with it when you get your slides. This is really just how the BBC style graphics. They call it a cookbook. So you actually know how to. Here, I can click on this because it won't take long. I just want to scroll down for you. But they show, they talk you through how to make beautiful data visualizations by using Python. So it's kind of cool. Like, you can answer sorts of questions, but what they're doing is showing you a cookbook. So what you do, and this is how I first learned, is I put my own data in there, right? If this is the source, I'll find my own source and just write that in there, and then save file path. I'll put my file name in here. You can use it really as a cookbook. Just save it, put your own information inside maybe the Anaconda Navigator or inside wherever you want to use Python. And boom, you can start answering your own data questions. In fact, I think I might have done that right here. So here's what mine looked like when I wanted to recreate the "We're Living Longer" slide right here, this one. So basically, you just install the package. You tell it what to. Pacman is a really good package that will load up a whole bunch of things for you. You make sure you have your libraries, because even if you install it on your machine, you have to call the library before you can write the code. Here's the simple code right here. I could swap out year 1973, year 2010 if it's available, and run that. These are pipes. What a pipe is like, they use like a car wash. Like, the car would go in and come out the other side, but like all the other things it needs to do its job, the brushes, the soap, all that stuff just happens when you pipe something. So that's what the pipe little notation is here. But I don't want us to get lost in the weeds, but I did want you to be able to see this. And, here's back again to the Healthcare Cost Institute. These are the publicly available files that you can go through, cost utilization reports. This is a lot of data that a lot of people might not think is publicly available. And then they have a lot of crosswalks, which mean they link a lot of different data set types together so that you can, say things more, more from different perspectives and link more files. And, I saved this slide. I don't even know where I got this. I was probably on some real world data presentation. And I really like that this is the different type of data buckets you can look at to answer questions. If you're looking at surveillance, look at safety outcomes that I showed you before. There's lots of things, risk factors, disease epidemiology. A lot of the data sources we looked at would point us in this direction. I like this. This was built by, I'll have to put the attribution here because I just think it's beautiful. This is from medical education. If you want to know what kind of information people look for, ask them, right? What's the Tableau thing? Ask the data, really ask your data. And this tells you where they're looking for information when they have a question about maybe a drug or something in their disease state. A lot of them are looking up dosage information, or they're looking up, I think I cut off the little yellow guy. I don't know what that one is. Medical research. They're looking at the latest for things about efficacy. Right along the scale, it tells you like how much stuff, what they're looking for. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is really important in environmental medicine. When you're looking at toxicities that are known, this is a really good data source. I think I used this one for when I was looking at the opioid and drug overdose information. So this will be in there too. And this is a chart I put together. I had written a book. Yeah, I wrote a book about looking for data. Of course, it becomes so obsolete within like 10 minutes because there's so many more data sets. But I took this page out of it so you'd have access to it, because this lists, I'll give you links to the ones that I put in here, but this gives you a little bit of oversight, like the FAERS data that we looked at, the FDA adverse event. Well, there's also MAUDE. And then there's MAUD, that's medical devices and vaccines. There's patients like me. If you want to look at the patient level thing, do silent listening or engage with patient advocacy groups. Utilization and payment data, longitudinal data, that's really important. MEPS data, which is medical expenditure, panel surveys. These are surveys that are really relevant. That's extremely important data as well. And this is the R Studio that I was talking about. I worked with the Anaconda. This is R Studio, completely free. It's on the cloud. I'm thinking of probably doing a class where we use the cloud and pull in, maybe a larger data set, and we can just kind of learn how to write a little bit of code. That'll be like an hour, kind of shorter little bites of information to learn from. But this goes back, I don't remember with the Makeover Monday discussion we were having, when they just showed that bar chart with the red, the green, and it just kind of showed the digital IT maturity. This is what I made in R in just like 5 minutes, because I wanted to understand what the data was trying to tell me before I could figure out if it was doing a good job or not, because that's how we rank the visualization, how it first appeared, and then we try to switch it out and make it look a little different, right? So here we can tell just at a glance, at writing like 3 lines of code, that most people do better on connectivity and human capital, right? Those are the pink and the beige. Less well on the digital public service, like expanding it into the public space and integrating into the community. And this is the countries are on the y-axis. Obviously, if it was being polished, the abbreviations would be out and clearly accessible. These are just abbreviations I use so I could fit it all on a window. Here's what it looked like when I pulled it up inside of R, and you could see the code that was written right here. It's not that much. And this is what it looks like in the upper left. It's just weighted scores, years, and country. And then, we come down here and we can create a plot line that at least allows us to say something about the digital environment. And this is just a little bit about R, but we'll go back to this, in future courses where we have more time to step through. I want to at least have your eyeballs. We got like 20 more slides. These are ggplot. This is all R. What's great about this is these are they're papered all over my office, little cheat sheets that tell you how to call a function. And they're just it may look like Greek to you at this moment in time, but it's all very helpful. And Tableau, which has got me started on this data journey. And really fast, I don't know if I can, let me see if I can show you this. This is my interpretation of that chart we saw in R with the digital maturity. And what I like about this is that you can look. Now, what happens is, and if I go through the years, you can see how it changes. You can look up at the top and see how it changes. And I put a trace so you can see where it was in the preceding square, right? So this is a trace, which is really important when you want to see where things came from and where they're going. But because the human eye doesn't do a great job of discerning like spherical size, is that a meaningful difference? I also ran the linear part on top of use of internet, and I have it by years. The original chart did not, for some reason, did not even delineate by year. So that's why I made this visualization, and it didn't take as long as you might think. And this is just showing Tableau with the new, the Magic Quadrant just came out, and Tableau, of course, is the leader. And if you go on Tableau Public, Andy Kriebel is somebody really good to follow. Oh, the mail's late. You guys hear the mail? That's Fred. That's Fred the Hound saying hi to the mailman. He's a good guy to start with because a lot of his data visualizations are very digestible and relevant, and you can reproduce them yourself. And here's what we were left with before, right? This is a spreadsheet. I mean, as you can tell, it's very thorough. I know this came out of the, do you remember the claims data, the Medicare spending and utilization? This was when I outputted the spreadsheet. This is what I was left with. And then, I don't know if you've heard of Tableau Prep. Tableau Prep is a really good tool for cleaning up the data. We don't really have time to kind of run through that like I wanted to, but that'll be next time. But if you look, you can filter all of this stuff, like all of these drug names. Some of them are talking about the same thing. I may have filtered some of them out. You know how many rows you have, so you know that each brand name has a generic equivalent, 2 and 2. You have the manufacturers. I remember, I think when I worked on this, I had to group some of the manufacturers together, dosage units, the total claims. And you can just clean this up by pivoting, by like, look at all the brand names down here for Abacavir. You know, maybe we can group these together and you can clean the data from this level before you even pull it into Tableau or wherever you're gonna use it as an end user. And you know, you have to have Richard Feynman in there. So I love this saying: the statements of science are not what is true and what is not true, but it's about probability. You know, how certain are we? And we can be more certain when we're asking the right questions with the right data. This, I think I am going to take a minute and go into this, because this is the most horrible survey I've ever seen in my life. I mean, this is a horrible, horrible survey. It doesn't ask the right univariate or multivariate amount of questions to be able to say anything. So, you know, that's going to be another topic of, you know, how to write better surveys. But let me click through, because I did, yeah. So basically, here's what the data looks like. It was a PDF in a document. Now, there's something called Tabula. Tabula can scrape PDFs that you find, as long as they're not images and they're actually PDFs. You can actually scrape the data out of them. And so this is how you do it. Here's Tabula. It asks you to preview it. You select the tables that you want in your to be exported out. And this is what it looks like. It's clean. Now, you may have noticed it stripped out the headers. I prefer to put them in manually anyway to make sure they're spelled right and correctly, you know, and they make sense and they're the ones I want. So I did do that really quickly here. This took like 10 minutes to clean it from Tabula. I was just able to, I had to eliminate a couple internal lines that were in there, and I had to add the headings. So now I have data I can analyze. So, I mean, it's from the survey, because it's ranking, I think the survey was ranking hospice providers based on measures that were selected. So, you know, just sort of trying to unwind and wrap down is like, you know, understanding what data do you need? And do you need to reformulate your question to get the data? Are there variables that you'd like to see in your data set? How you visualize that data? What questions will you need to ask? Do you know how to ask them in a way that will yield accurate data? Do you know how to clean or restructure your data? And what are you comparing? And this is just a little bit about just the Likert scales, and they don't work really well in my book, but if that's all we have, you at least need to make sure that you're using the right point scale so that you can make them less noisy. Are you looking at bipolar? Is it just really a scale of disagree and agree and gradations of that? Are you asking, you need to put a little bit of, or we need to put a little more thought into how we construct these questions. And that'll be a future topic, I'm sure. And a unipolar construct, it's a 5-point scale with a neutral midpoint. Always label your points, because what's going to happen is people are going to go 0, 5, or 10 just because of the way this is labeled. And that may not equate with, what they really want to measure. In fact, a common practice that I've learned from a research methodologist in survey design, I reviewed his book in Palgrave. Palgrave makes a really good book of survey handbook. Just throw out the 7 because it makes people really have to be mindful about their 6 and their 8. So across the board, he just throws out the 7, which I think is funny. Now, the dangers of a one-sided story. I think we probably know on some level there's no way Prince William is going to step out of his car and give a crowd the bird. And he didn't. But this picture on top was everywhere, right? And that's why it's important not to have a one-sided story and to be visual, right? When we looked at the quartets and we saw that the descriptive statistics didn't really represent what was happening once we graphed it, because your vision, it's a third of your brain by volume, but it's 2/3 of the brain's resources. And we also prefer the story over straight data, right? When I put a story around something, it's a lot more compelling than just showing you some numbers. And the part that I really liked, especially if you're one of us that likes to talk to ourselves, we talk to ourselves in a story format. We don't just shoot numbers out in brief little, quips and quotes. And here's where you can find me, mostly on Twitter at Datamonger Bonnie. If you have any questions, we can follow up through there. You can either private message me if you want, or you can go out into the Twitter sphere and we can talk there. And I thank you so much for participating, and keep your eye out for future things. We're going to add the capacity maybe more for a Q&A live and for chat functions, but I really wanted to get through the breadth of information here, because if you have a need around data sourcing, I wanted to get those resources to you. But we'll be adding more of a chat feature as we get a little more mature with the offerings that we have here. So please reach out on Twitter, and I will be sending these out to you, I want to say within 48 hours, maybe sooner. So thank you very much, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.